Good. Okay. So Tracy, begin.
Okay, I'm glad to be here. This is exciting. I've been intensely researching PFAS and sewage sludge for several years. Sewage sludge keeps coming up in my life. It's kind of funny. So tonight I want to make the case that sewage sludge is so highly contaminated with PFAS and other pollutants that it should never be managed for use as a compost or soil amendment. Anaerobic digestion of sewage sludge can be used to capture methane so that the methane that forms in an anaerobic situation in a landfill is not released into the atmosphere. But I understand that co-digestion of food waste with sewage sludge has been proposed in New York, as it has been proposed in Westchester County, for example. It was also recommended in the New York State's climate scoping plan. This is an ill-conceived approach, as food waste can be turned into a healthy and safe compost, whereas sewage sludge cannot. So I'm going to present information about the toxic contamination of sewage sludge and consider some of the sources of contamination with PFAS, as well as the potential health and environmental impacts. I just wanted to show where I live. I'm in the long blue county in eastern New York. That's Washington County. So sewage sludge is the semi-solid residue from municipal wastewater treatment plants. I like the fact that Science Direct made note of the fact that it has contaminants and pathogens that get into sewage sludge from different sources.
Oops, sorry.
I'm not looking at so I'm sorry, I need to say next slide. I'm sorry.
You did say, sorry about that.
I'm not used to that. Okay. So concentrations are found in all sewage sludge of PFAS have been found in all sewage sludge that's been tested, to my knowledge, at levels in the parts per billion. As a reference, the maximum contaminant level for PFOA and PFOS in New York in drinking water is 10 parts per trillion, so approximately 1,000 times lower. PFAS are water soluble, they're highly mobile, and they leach into groundwater. They're also taken up by plants. Interestingly, New York State is not vigorously regulating sewage sludge. They're not even testing sewage sludge. I mean, there's about 600 wastewater treatment plants, and the state DEC has tested 8 different samples. And those samples were tested in 2017. I can answer any other questions about it because I have been in touch periodically with the regulator. So I'm very proud of these bar charts. Next slide. Yes, these were done for us by a retired chemical engineer who worked for DuPont for 42 years and is now a National Sierra Club volunteer. So these are the results for the 8 wastewater treatment plants that have been tested. The state of Maine has established maximum contaminant levels for 2 PFAS compounds, 2.5 parts per billion for PFOA and 5.2 parts per billion for PFOS. As you can see, the composite levels of PFAS are far higher than that. Often, almost all of them are higher than 50 parts per billion. Some are higher than 100 parts per billion, and one is higher than 200 parts per billion. This is the next slide is from a report called Sludge in the Garden, done by the Sierra Club and the Ann Arbor Ecology Center. Volunteers purchased biosolids compost that was bagged from big box stores, not only in Michigan, but in other parts of the country. And they sampled it and sent it to labs for testing. They tested for total organic fluorine, which is one way of getting around the fact that there are between 4,000 and 14,000 PFAS compounds, and testing is only available for up to 100 if you're lucky, and usually more like 15 to 30. So they also tested for different compounds. And so this bar graph shows the results. These are all from that report, which you can easily find online, Sludge in the Garden, except the second from the right is from my county, from Washington County Sewer District compost. We have a very rural county. So the county manages, I guess, manages the sewer district. And a resident, our group, the Clean Air Action Network, is suing the town of Monroe Planning Board for determining that the first sewage sludge biochar plant in the state would have, which is still in the proposal stage, would have no significant environmental impacts. There's many thousands of people who are opposing this plant. And one of the residents took it upon himself to purchase a cubic yard of compost from across the Hudson River, from the sewage, from these wastewater treatment plants. And he spent hundreds of dollars to have it tested. It's the second highest in this graph, the second to the right. We're going to be doing a press conference in a week or two. So it's worth knowing how sewage sludge is disposed of. Sewage sludge is actually a huge problem, especially for larger municipalities. This comes from an EPA Inspector General report. And as you can see, the green shows that almost half of the sewage sludge in the US is land applied as a fertilizer or compost, usually to farmland. Some of it is incinerated. I believe the surface disposal refers to landfilling. Next slide. Next. Oh, I'm sorry. That was the slide I was referring to. Next slide after that. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out. Okay. So the Environmental Working Group estimates that sewage sludge has contaminated 20 million acres of cropland in the US, about 5% of the total cropland in the country. Also, there's no requirement that farmers, gardeners, or anyone else be warned that compost or fertilizers made from sewage sludge contain concerning levels of PFAS. Next slide. So this Inspector General report from the EPA that I alluded to determined that there's hundreds of unregulated pollutants in land applied biosolids, which is another name for sewage sludge. And these include brominated flame retardants, pharmaceuticals, including highly toxic chemo drugs, and endocrine disruptors like birth control pills, as well as heavy metals. Currently, heavy metals are the only toxic pollutant that wastewater treatment plants are required to test for under federal regulations. They have to test for 9 heavy metals. I did some FOIL requests for the test results from Glens Falls, a small city that's 20 miles from my home, and there were high cadmium levels, high zinc and copper, and high lead. And I asked a now emeritus professor of soil science at Cornell to assess these results, and he stated that they would have harmful effects to crops, livestock, and human health. So some of you may be more familiar than others with PFAS. I'm going to go over what PFAS is quickly. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So it's a plural noun. Because PFAS compounds typically have a carbon backbone that is saturated with fluorine instead of hydrogen. Fluorine readily replaces hydrogen when you're making PFAS. So it's usually, and so here's the structure. The next slide, please. This is the structure of the two most notorious PFAS. You see the carbon backbone with 2 fluorines per carbon, and then other functional groups at the end. And that's typical. Fluorine, I mentioned fluorine. Fluorine is an element like carbon or hydrogen on the periodic table. It's in the same column as chlorine and bromine. These are halogens, which are extremely reactive, and yet they form extremely stable compounds. The carbon fluorine bond is not found in nature. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, it's not found in nature, and therefore organisms have not evolved mechanisms such as enzymes to break the carbon fluorine bond. PFAS are categorized as persistent organic pollutants like PCBs and DDT, which also contain chlorine, which also contain halogens. They're called organic because they contain carbon. I think this speaks for itself, and we're going to talk about why I mentioned why they're so persistent. They're also persistent in human bodies and in other animals. So real quickly, I'm going to tell you how we know about PFAS, and I need to speed up. PFAS were not known by scientists were not familiar with PFAS for the most part, nor was the EPA until a lawsuit was filed against DuPont for its Teflon factory in Parkersburg, West Virginia, which contaminated drinking water in many communities downriver of the plant. They were not drawing water from the river directly, but the water had gotten into groundwater and contaminated it. DuPont, so the next slide, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm several slides, I'm not very good at this. Okay, next slide after that, please. So PFOA is a precursor to Teflon. Teflon is now made with another precursor. PFOA is water soluble. It forms suds, and the plant was dumping 50,000 pounds of PFOA into the Ohio River annually. Next slide. We're going to skip this, but Rob Ballot is the one who filed the lawsuit, which through discovery found that DuPont knew full well that PFOA was a carcinogen. It could cause birth defects. It had other serious health problems, and that it had contaminated the drinking water in numerous communities, because they were actually sending employees to test water, to collect water at country stores and bring it back to the lab to be tested for PFOA, which they called C8, I believe. So the first lawsuit, the first class action lawsuit again over harm caused by PFAS was settled for $343 million and the next slide. The really great thing is the plaintiff group decided that they were not going to accept individual settlements, but they were going to use the settlement to fund the world's largest human epidemiological study on the health effects of a single pollutant. Over 40,000 people participated because they also decided to pay people $400 to have their blood tested for PFOA and share their medical records. And as a result, it was a long epidemiological study, but they found a number of health effects. Next slide. And next slide after that. Okay, so on the health conditions and diseases that are in red are the 6 conditions that were positively linked with PFOA. There were blood tests, so people, they knew how high a level of PFOA people had in their blood, and they could do some associations in this huge study. Next slide. This is something that a colleague of mine did, another volunteer. And the only thing missing from the main health conditions is ulcerative colitis. On that next slide. And this was one of the impacted community members. And you can see some facial deformities. This man is now an adult with a healthy son, but there was another woman in the plant who, besides his mother, who worked with PFOA, who also had a child with similar birth defects. Next slide. So EPA has been steadily realizing that PFAS are more dangerous than was originally thought, and the testing methodology is developing. So in June of 2022, EPA issued new health advisories. Next slide. So they determined that PFOA is 17,500 times more toxic than they thought in 2016 and 100,000 times more toxic than they thought in 2009. By the way, 1 part per trillion is equal to a single drop in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So we are talking about some really minute levels. PFAS is very persuasive in the environment. This was a recent study of where PFAS was likely to be found. These 57,000 locations have not all been tested. Next slide. But the interesting thing is the top 4 types of sites in which PFAS is likely to be detected are military sites and airports, and that's because of PFOS firefighting foam, wastewater treatment plants, and industrial facilities. Next slide. So it's next slide after that. It's important to know why PFAS is used so widely. Next slide. So PFAS have some common properties: the fire and heat resistance, no stick, water repellency, stain resistance, oil and grease resistance, and they are cheap. They also have characteristics that threaten public health and the environment. Their persistence, toxicity, that plants take them up, that they bioaccumulate up the food chain, just like DDT. They leach through the soil, they're mobile in the environment, and they're water soluble. Next slide. Common uses are in cleaning products and sprays for water repellency, floor wax, things like that, outdoor clothing, outdoor gear, dental floss, toothpaste, shampoo, and cosmetics and other and body care products. Next slide. Teflon has been with us for more than 50 years. It was first used to coat valves and seals in the Manhattan Project's uranium enrichment plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and it's been in widespread use for cookware since the 1950s. Next slide. It's also used in cleaning products. Next slide. Here's a list of some of the things that PFAS are intentionally added to. Next slide. The latest revelation comes from a study that PFAS is pervasive in toilet paper. And the source, this study came out about a week ago. And it involved testing toilet paper collected from 4 continents. North America, South America, Africa, and Europe. They found a particular type of PFAS in both paper, toilet paper, and sewage sludge, and they attribute this type of PFAS to use in wood to pulp conversion in paper production. Very, very alarming. Next slide. New York State has banned PFAS in several applications. Intentionally added PFAS in apparel. This goes into effect at the end of this year. PFAS in carpet will no longer be allowed to be sold in a few years. And the ban on PFAS intentionally added to plant-based fiber-based food packaging went into effect in December. Next slide. PFAS has been present in many takeout containers and also fiber-based disposable plates and bowls that do not leak liquids and grease. Next slide. I don't expect you to read this. This is the flow chart for the implementation from New York State DEC for the implementation of the food packaging ban. DEC is requiring food establishments like supermarkets and restaurants that have takeout containers to check with the distributors of all their products to determine if there's any intentionally added PFAS in these products. This is an absurd proposition. I mean, it assumes that distributors have a working knowledge of PFAS. So, so much for implementation of that law. Next slide. Kerrygold butter was recalled very recently from stores across New York State after testing revealed that it has 80 parts per million in the food contact paper. The recall did not come because a food establishment contacted a distributor. The recall came because someone filed a lawsuit under general business law. There's an article you can find on MSN. Just search Kerrygold recall, butter recall. Next slide. Yeah, all those long-wearing cosmetics have PFAS to prevent running of mascara and such. Very dangerous practice. And obviously cosmetics wash off and get into our wastewater. Next slide. Simply wanted to say that PFAS are incidental contaminants in many products because they're used as manufacturing aids, as in the paper mills. Next slide. I'm going to skip this, but you cannot destroy PFAS with incineration. You need a temperature at least 2,500 degrees Celsius to break the carbon-fluorine bond. Next slide. Yeah, we're going to skip this. Next slide. Landfill leachates are another source of PFAS, not surprisingly, given all the PFAS in consumer products. And guess where landfill leachates go? To wastewater treatment plants that cannot remove PFAS or any other contaminants from the pollutants that are at the landfills. Next slide. So we can skip this one too. Okay, this is a lovely diagram of the cycle of contamination from wastewater to farms and gardens. Next slide. As I said, a third to a half of all sewage sludge is land applied, and no testing for PFAS is required in most states, including New York. Maine has been a leader. Maine has last year, next slide, and then slide after that. Maine banned the land application of sewage sludge last year. first state in the country. They also established a $60 million compensation fund for impacted farmers. And the state is testing at least 700 farms and former farm sites on which sewage sludge-based composts and fertilizers were applied in the last 40 years. New York is doing nothing of the sort. Next slide. Use of sewage sludge on certified organic farms is banned under the National Organic Standards. However, next slide. Some certified organic farmers have discovered that their farms were contaminated from sewage sludge applications decades ago. These young farmers bought their farm from someone who was dying of cancer. That person lived on the farm with highly contaminated ground drinking water, and sewage sludge had been applied about 40 years earlier. Next slide. Okay, going to compost. This comes from Waste Dive, an important industry news source. Some compost has been tested, food and yard waste compost have been tested and found to contain PFAS. And I suspect that this comes from food packaging, takeout containers, etc. And so my recommendation is that no packaging, even if it's certified to be compostable and PFAS free, be allowed in food waste collection. And that's because compost operators are not able to examine every piece of food packaging before it's added to the compost operation. It's just totally impractical. Next slide. We'll skip this one. So there is some good news. Investors are pressuring because of the liability involved. Investors are pressuring top firms to halt production of toxic forever chemicals. And 3M announced that it's going to stop making PFAS in 2025. The problem is that now PFAS is being produced in other parts of the world. I want to leave you with a few suggestions for additional reading and watching. Exposure is the memoir by Rob Bilott, the attorney, about his PFAS litigation. I also have an interview in the Sun magazine a year ago, which is easy to find online by looking at my name, searching my name and the Sun. And it's an interview with Rob. Next slide. Oh, yes. Okay. So there's a few films that I would recommend. Dark Waters, which is about the Parkersburg, West Virginia situation, and also a documentary called The Devil We Know, which you can find on YouTube. It's an excellent documentary. And there's some other documentaries you can find on YouTube. Final slide, or almost final slide. So this is my sentiment exactly. And last slide, I believe. Yes. So you're welcome to contact me. Any questions, I hope.
Yeah, so let's get the hands raised and we will start the questioning, and then if there's any, I prefer people raise their hands and ask their questions instead of putting them in the chat, but we'll go from there. Sharon, you had your hand up first, so your first question.
I had put it in the chat, but can you discuss the term, what did I say? What is it called? Intentionally added.
Yes.
Coming from a textile and manufacturing background, I understand where some PFAS has some properties, especially in outdoor wear that humans like and sell the products. But outside of that,
well, there in school uniforms, PFAS has been found. Stain resistance, for stain resistance, I assume. Yeah, and clearly in food packaging, you know, it was first found in fast food wrappers. Some of that has been phased out, but it's in wide use in many things. You know, it's been found in ski wax, car wax, floor wax. The heat resistant properties, it's in the insulation around electrical wiring.
It's everywhere.
It's
Saying it's everywhere. Is it so pervasive that we should be hopeless?
No, because it's cumulative. So the more PFAS you have in your bodies, the higher risk you have of damage. There are remedy or detoxification methods that have not been commercialized yet for the most part. They're never going to be available, I don't think, for sewage sludge, or certainly not for farmland. But they are being developed, in the process of being, you know, scaled up for water, for example. So, and also possibly for dealing with filters that are contaminated.
And so when is it intentional versus not intentional?
Incidental, when it's a manufacturing aid or it's a result of recycling. We have to be really careful about recycling, because currently there is no monitoring or testing of materials that are being recycled. So
if I've been of the personal opinion that textile to textile recycling is part of the solution to textile waste. Not all, but part of it. Does that mean screening for PFAS before you recycle a piece of material that could have PFAS in it? And is there an easy test for that?
total organic fluorine. You don't have to test for all these different compounds. As you can see, with 14,000 possibly, you only can test for like 15 to 100 depending on the test and depending on the lab. So you can screen for total fluorine content or total organic fluorine. And I can put you in touch with the people who did the sewage sludge in the sludge in the garden report, because that's the first test they did. So I can get people's contact information and questions and get back to them through Matt.
That would be great. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Sharon. So the next question, I'm just doing in the order that it's popped up on the participants list. So Mary Jo Burke, you are next.
Unmute. Oh, hi. I have a number of questions. I did a presentation to the MSWAB a number of years ago about PFAS, and one of the things, so many questions came up there. One of the things you talked about was food packaging, and I know there's an organization that used to test for PFAS containment or for PFAS contamination. And I don't remember if it's BioCycle, or there are a number of them that did that. And are they still doing that?
Yeah, I'm going to put down a few organizations that do testing. I'm just going to put that in the chat.
Okay, great.
Well, I'll just say them. They're easy to spell. Mamavation is, I think, was started by a mother to help families avoid toxics in their products. Environmental Working Group. I don't know if they're testing, but they're reporting on products. Silent Spring Institute was involved someone from Silent Spring Institute was involved in the initial food packaging testing, maybe 5 years ago. Green Science Policy Institute also rates products. So that's what comes up and in my head. And also there's a professor, Graham Peasley at Notre Dame. He's a nuclear physicist, I think, but he has done a lot of testing in textiles.
Okay. And then, so when you're talking about paper products being contaminated, I get mushrooms from the farmer's market in a paper bag, and then I take that paper bag to compost my food scraps. So how do I find out if that's a bad thing now?
Well, paper bags are probably some recycled paper. I mean, I have used cardboard to kill grass in my garden. I have extensive gardens. I'm not going to do that anymore. In fact, I think I'm going to write an article warning people about that, but I don't think these are good practices. You know, that's my current thinking on this. It's all new. No one knew. Yeah, we thought paper bags were clean, but if they're from recycled paper and if they're from paper, and there's contamination as a result of the paper making process.
Yeah. And then lastly, quickly, there's a Radiolab story on, it's called the Poop Train, about taking New York City sludge out west to be sold because nobody would take it until they got from New York City until they got farther out. So I would imagine that stopped now, but that was part of the study. Or no, I'm sorry, was it the study was the 40 years back? Was that in Maine? Or is that throughout the country?
It was in Maine. In New York, there's no kind of chain of custody. There's a company called Casella, a big waste company, publicly traded in Vermont that has a factory that they process sewage sludge to make fertilizer in northern New York. And there's no testing for PFAS. And and they sell it and give it away. I think they give it away because they have so much of it and they're already paid a tipping fee to accept the sewage sludge. But there's no record keeping once it's a product. There's no record keeping if it's a compost. There's record keeping. There is some record keeping if it comes directly from the wastewater treatment plant, but it's not very good. So,
Thank you.
Sure.
Super. Thank you, Mary Jo. And now the next question will be from Joyce Bielik.
Yeah, hi, thanks. And thank you for that great report. There's so much to know. So I'm unfamiliar with some of these issues, specifically the relationship between wastewater and the sewage sludge that you mentioned. And I want to add that New York City now, the city council is considering a bill to test wastewater. But I haven't found the bill, but I would hope that it would be looking at PFAS.
Yes.
So do you think that that you pretty much could get at the problem from looking at wastewater?
Well, there is a bill pending in the state Senate by Senator Rachel May. I think she's from Syracuse, that would require the testing of the effluent from wastewater treatment plants. And I could share with Matt the link. I can't do it right now, but the link to a report that was commissioned by the state of Vermont, where they had a private company, consulting firm that tested all the sewage sludge at all the wastewater treatment plants, as well as the effluent, and found PFAS in it. So PFAS coming from the water coming from wastewater treatment plants that's going into the rivers, the Long Island Sound, lakes, Lake Champlain, for example, that will inevitably have PFAS.
And May's bill calls for testing for PFAS?
For all wastewater treatment plants. Also, Earth Justice, I believe, submitted comments. There were permit to New York State DEC. There were permit renewals up from a number of wastewater treatment plants, and they did not require PFAS testing of effluent. And so Earth Justice reached out to Sierra Club and said, would you be our client, and we'll submit these comments. I believe they did submit the comments asking DEC to require PFAS testing.
Excellent. Okay, another quick question. So you talk about PFAS in relation to paper. What about plastics?
Okay.
Isn't PFAS one of the chemicals that will give plastic their shape, whatever, their so-called usefulness?
Yes, and in fact, I took those slides out because my talk would have been 3 hours if I'd gone into everything. And I could provide some links to that. the two organizations that have worked on this that I know of are the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, which works with whistleblowers primarily, and Environmental Defense Fund, which has a chemical engineer who's done some excellent work on fluorination of plastics and plastics that are used, plastic barrels that are used to ship raw ingredients and processed ingredients, including food, have FDA approved the fluorination of polyethylene, and he believes polypropylene, but he hasn't found that yet. He hasn't found the documents for that. They approved this process in the early or mid 80s. At that point, they approved for outrageous amounts of total fluorine in the contents of these barrels. And recently, EPA, I think last year or the year before, they took these 40-gallon, perhaps 40-gallon plastic barrels that were fluorinated. They put a fluorine gas in it, and because it's such a reactive, fluorine is so reactive, it pushes out the hydrogens in the carbon of the plastic and replaces them with fluorines. And basically it makes PFAS film in the plastic. And the reason that this is desirable is it helps keep out moisture and oxygen from the contents. And it is still done today. The FDA did not respond to a petition to end this from Environmental Defense Fund. And the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, well, after EPA did a few experiments where they put neutral pH water in these vessels, these fluorinated vessels, and they left it there for 24 hours as well as for a number of weeks, and they tested it. In 24 hours, it was far higher than the New York State drinking water standard. They also put methanol, a type of alcohol, and it absorbed the PFAS much more quickly. So, and PEER, that organization, wrote a letter to EPA, FDA, and the USDA, and they did not do anything as a result, saying you've got to stop this process. There is no knowledge of how pervasive it is, or even where it's being done. I think EDF found one site where it's being done, but there's like very limited information. And organic foods are being dealt with in the same way, we imagine.
Oh, wow. So thank you. You said that you would send some information about the Rachel May bill, and also some detail about the plastics and PFAS.
Yes, the fluorinated plastics.
Yeah, the fluorinated plastic. That would be
Yes.
great to get that information. We have a plastics campaign here.
Right.
Great.
We do.
Thank you.
Thank
Maggie,
you.
thank you, Joyce. Maggie, you're next.
Well, this is absolutely hair-raising. I mean, this is one of the most important things we've listened to for a long time. So just a couple of questions. You know, it was mentioned in the chat that the good EPR bills prohibit PFAS in packaging, but what about the rest of the things that we acquire? You know, consumer goods, food, you know, that's one question. I've got two more, but you
Okay,
maybe
well,
answer
I'll
that
take
one.
them one at a time so I can remember. There needs to be a ban on all PFAS, you know, the whole class. And there's been, you know, now EPA is looking at 4 PFAS. I mean, there's 4,000 to 14,000. That's ridiculous. We need to look at the whole class. There's the problem of regrettable substitutions. So if you ban PFOA, you get Gen X, which is has health problems of its own, is water soluble, and is already contaminating water extensively in North Carolina near where it's made. So I would advise in any legislation that anyone attempts to get written and passed, that you look at implementation, because DEC is pretty hopeless on implementation. If there's any wiggle room, I mean, it's unbelievable what they're doing with the PFAS in food packaging ban. I think that lawsuit on Kerrygold was brought by a New York City law firm that does class action lawsuits. I don't know this firsthand. Someone read the article that I sent her, and she looked into it and she told me that, but I haven't looked into it myself. So it's possible that we can get some things happening, not by looking at enforcement, but by class action lawsuits. But we need some legislation, and we need people working on this.
And this information needs to get to the legislators urgently,
Mhm.
what we've just heard.
Yes.
If PFAS is found in soil, as you were talking about those farmers, how is it removed? It sounds like you can't.
There's no way. I mean, if you're talking about 100 acres, how do you remove that? You would kill any soil life. You would destroy the integrity of the soil, destroy all the organic matter. I mean, what they're still doing, there is no way to remove PCBs from soil. In my area on the Hudson River, I live, as you noted, I live about 14 miles from, or 12 miles from where the GE plants were that dumped PCBs from their capacitor plants into the Hudson River. And they still have what neighbors of it call a dirt burner.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it. But they're still burning contaminated soil, heating it. They probably say it's not being burned, but you don't want to do that with farm soil. I don't think there's any answers. I think we have to stop this process immediately. Other questions?
Yeah, how is PFAS measured in the human body, and are these studies being done?
Yes, blood tests. Many of the people in Hoosick Falls, where there was a factory that intentionally added PFAS, a Teflon coating, and contaminated the drinking water, both from the smokestacks and dumping in the river or in the water body. Hundreds or thousands of people had their blood tested by the state. I don't think it's real easy to get your blood tested independently. I don't know for sure.
And what are the results of those tests?
They were very high. I actually took out another slide. There was a campaign where people would write on a piece of cardboard their like a sign, their name and their test results, and there were whole families, and they would take pictures and put that on social media.
Wow.
And there were very high levels. And in fact, the young farm couple in Maine that I showed a picture of, they had levels that were 50 or 100 times the average American from living on that land for 8 years and drinking the water. So they had levels like factory workers from being farmers.
Well, I hope that the SWAB can get involved in lobbying on this issue.
Was the blood
Not
testing?
a question.
Okay.
So
And
I'm gonna follow up with what Maggie's talked about for just 1 second. I'm gonna just jump in here. The question I have is, we send half the waste on the west side of Manhattan to the Essex County incinerator. There's PFAS impregnated materials going into that incinerator. It's reasonable to say that it's not being destroyed, it's being aerosolized and sent back over Manhattan and Brooklyn. Is that right?
oh, you're talking about Newark, New Jersey.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah.
Well, I didn't know it was Essex County, but that's why I realized.
Yeah.
Exactly. It is being, yes.
Because
And
there's no way they can reach temperatures to destroy that in a commercial incinerator.
I'll send you a document from the testing. There was testing done, biological testing in Europe, in different countries where they tested the moss that was downwind of incinerators. They tested other things such as that.
That would be good. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Peter, you're next. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in the line.
I have 3 brief questions. First of all, how do the PFAS levels in biosolids compare with the existing levels in many farms and gardens where it might be applied?
There's been no testing. We don't know. Testing
Okay.
has been done in Maine because you know, the state has made a commitment. The state in New York, they tested 8 sewage sludge at 8 wastewater treatment plants. The levels were high, and they tested sewage sludge first from wastewater treatment plants where it was being land applied. The state did not inform the wastewater treatment plants. They did not inform the farms. They did not inform anyone. In fact, the regulator who I've talked with a number of times, I talked with her, I believe it was 3 years ago, for like an hour on the phone. And I asked about testing. I mentioned PFAS. She did not inform me that the state had tested for PFAS in 2017. The first I knew about it was last year when I finally did a foil because I wasn't getting anything any other way. And I was shocked to find out they had done testing.
Is there a problem with anaerobic digestion of food waste in facilities only used by that material?
No,
Okay. And is there a problem with biosolids being applied to abandoned strip mines as a soil additive for growing trees?
I would say yes, because it leaches into groundwater and it runs off into rivers. You know, you can't contain, water moves things. I lived
Thank
in
you.
I lived in West Virginia, and there are people living near strip mines. Believe me.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Sharon, briefly, we have to skedaddle, but if you have a brief question, go ahead.
I guess I just am curious how, for like the Kerry gold butter, the PFAS are in the foil wrapper around the butter.
It's
How-
paper inside the foil. It's like a paper foil thing, I believe.
So it literally jumps from the paper into the food product.
I am pretty sure there's been testing, not of Kerry gold, but of other. We know that PFAS are highly mobile. They're water soluble. They move. And yes, granted, butter is not water, but
Well,
they
there's
mobile.
way more, so
Yeah.
yeah. But oh,
Super. All right, Tracy, I want to thank you for spending an hour with us this evening, and this was extremely eye-opening.
So
As Maggie said, hair-raising experience. I have to admit that this was really very disturbing.
yes,
So-
but I just want to make, in closing, I just want to say, yes, PFAS is in many places, but it doesn't mean we should just give up on it and let it be in more places and greater levels of contamination. There is still hope, and as you saw, the tide is turning, that there's a lot of pressure on companies to remove it. REI just announced that they were going to remove it in a few years, as is Patagonia, which announced that much earlier than REI. But you know, I see that many product manufacturers are realizing that they need to start doing something about this. So do not hesitate to email me if you have any questions. I don't necessarily remember all the things that I had said I would send, other than before the Rachel May bill. So Matt, if you can get back to me and let me know, I will get it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
That was
you.
wonderful.
I look
Thank you.
forward to you guys doing stuff.